Engagement for the Friends of International Humanitarian Law. I'd like to welcome you to the first IHL event for 2011. Glad to see that there are so many interested people come along tonight. I hope you enjoy the evening. We're going to have three speakers presenting on their experiences overseas, two at international criminal tribunals and one at a master's program overseas. And then we'll follow the presentations with a question and answer session. So if you'd like to leave your questions until after the presentations, that'd be appreciated. I'd like to begin by thanking the Caston Centre for booking this room, organising all the chairs and tables. It's a fantastic location in the city. It makes it very central and easy to access. In particular, I'd like to thank Erica Contini and Janice Hugo at the Caston Centre for organising this. For those of you who aren't aware of Friends of IHL, we are a group affiliated with the Australian Red Cross, and we assist the Red Cross in fulfilling their mandate of communicating to the public and educating the public on issues and developments in international humanitarian law. We've been running a number of events since 2009, including the International Humanitarian Law and the Young Lawyer tonight, and other events including research activities. We coordinate volunteers who go away and research issues that are developing in IHL, and they submit their reports back to us. And those reports are used for ARC Red Cross officers throughout Australia. We also coordinate volunteers to talk to high school students in high schools around Melbourne to educate them in issues of international humanitarian law. We coordinate international humanitarian law mooting and other public lectures and events. I'd like to flag that this evening we have our new president, or who will be our new president very soon. Our current president, Carolyn, will be leaving us at the end of March. She's giving birth to her first baby, and we'd like to welcome Anna Hood to the role of presidency at the end of March. Anna is a PhD candidate at the Melbourne Law School, and although we're sorry to see Carolyn move on from the position, I'm sure that we're equally happy to see Anna take over, and I'm sure she'll be dedicated and enthusiastic about taking over the role. So I'd like to begin the evening by introducing our first speaker. Stephen Muirhead is a recent graduate from the Melbourne Law School. He's currently completing his honours year in the Maths department at the University of Melbourne, and the second half of last year he spent 5 months at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in the judges' chambers in the French language section. So if you've heard about other experiences at the International Criminal Tribunals, I'm sure that Stephen's will be slightly different and perhaps more interesting. So, Stephen, would you like to make him welcome?
All right. So, as James mentioned, I spent 5 months at the ICTY between July and December last year. And just so we're all on the same page, I might briefly mention what the ICTY actually is before I go into talking about my experiences of the internship. So the ICTY is the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, which is a UN-affiliated international tribunal, which was set up to try those most responsible for the international crimes committed on the territory of the former Yugoslavia in the period of 1992 to the present day. So what that includes is the war in Bosnia primarily, and the war in Kosovo, but also fighting that occurred in Croatia and Serbia to a lesser extent. So the ICTY has its seat in The Hague and has been operating since about 1995 to the present day. And it's just in the process of winding up, given that we are 20 years almost after the actual events that it's set up to cover. So it's in the process of winding down, but it's still operating at near full capacity at the moment. So that's a picture of the ICTY, very beautiful building in The Hague. And the ICTY has an internship program for students in later years of law school and also recent graduates, to come and experience what the ICTY actually does for a period between 3 to 6 months. So that's the program I applied for. And if you asked me at this point last year what that would actually entail, I wouldn't have been able to tell you, because in fact the information out there is very limited as to what interns actually do. If you go to the website, there's a little bit of information, but it's all pretty vague terms. So I had some preconceived notions about what it was going to turn out to be like, but in fact most of my preconceived notions turned out to be inaccurate. So I thought I'd structure this a little bit like a list of things that I thought would happen that didn't actually turn out that way, or at least the preconceptions that I had that didn't turn out to be so accurate. And maybe that will assist you in a decision whether or not you want to actually go there and experience the internship for yourselves. So the first thing that really struck me about STY was the sheer size of the organisation. It really is a behemoth of an institution. There's 2,000 paid staff full-time. The budget is about $300 million. And this here is just one of its 3 buildings in The Hague. So it's really a massive place. And it's about twice the size of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, and probably about 100 times the size of the ICJ, the International Criminal Court. So there's a couple of corollaries that kind of flow from this size. And the first thing, on a positive note, is the social aspect of being an intern at STY. Because it's so big, there's about 100 interns there at any given time. And so that means you really feel a part of a little community of interns that are there with similar interests to experience a similar sort of thing in the IHL world. And so it really, for me, in the social side of things, which perhaps is not such an important part of your decision whether to go there, but for me it kind of was. And it really felt a little bit like a university exchange in how kind of the social side is set up. It's really, you meet a whole lot of interesting people from all around the world with different backgrounds, and that's a really fantastic part about it. The second aspect of it, which is perhaps not so positive, or it depends on what you're hoping to get out of the ICTY, but that is how the size of it relates to the nature of the work that you'll be doing there. So I was placed in chambers, and when you get the acceptance letter, it tells you you're placed in chambers, and it tells you nothing else about what that actually means. So I was expecting one of two things. Either I was going to be some sort of general ad hoc intern, problem solver, do whatever they want me to do, photocopy, I don't know, or I'd be assigned to a judge, and I'd be doing a kind of judge's associate like you might do in the federal court or the magistrates court here in Melbourne. So in fact it turned out to be neither of those things, and it was quite different to a judge's associate. And the reason for that is because, again, there's so many people at the ICTY that you're really a small cog in the whole machinery of the whole place. So while you are attached to a case, and each intern in chambers is assigned to a specific case, you're not working directly with the judges. And that's because in each case there is 3 judges assigned to the case, but there's also about 10 to 15 paid full-time staff who are professionals in the IHL field, and they're sitting on the level below the judges. So they work directly with the judges in chambers. They're not the prosecution or the defense, they're in chambers working with the judges. And then there's the interns, there's a kind of third tier below them. So that means that your interaction with the judges is not direct, it's kind of through this second tier of full-time paid staff. So that is a slight negative aspect of the tribunal. If you're expecting to be a judge's associate and to be doing research directly side by side with him, that's not what it's going to turn out to be like. And indeed, although I probably shouldn't be saying this at a talk about IHL, the actual IHL aspect of the work that you do is quite minimal. And by that, I mean that you're not doing research on finer points of international humanitarian law while you're there. You're probably not going to be using your intricate knowledge of the Geneva Conventions or anything like that. Although IHL is definitely a fabulous background, almost an essential background to some extent into doing an internship there. It's mainly to get an overview of what the tribunal does and what the work there is aiming to achieve. You don't actually need to know the details of international humanitarian law. So from that perspective, it was a little bit of a disappointment, I have to be perfectly honest, in that you're not working directly with the legal side of the cases. That's for the paid staff, and that's what they're paid to do. And secondly, I didn't even end up getting to go to court, which is a great disappointment for me. Most interns get to go to court. If you're in chambers, you're with a case, and so you're sitting in court to hear evidence. My case, on the other hand, had finished its evidentiary phase, and so all the witnesses had already been called, and it was in the phase of writing a judgment, which is a long extended process, which goes on for in some cases several years. So I didn't get to go to court, which was a different experience for most people. So what did I do? And I did two main things there. First of all, I analysed evidence. Now, the ICTY is very different to probably a domestic court in Australia, in that the rules of evidence are much more liberal than anything you're going to find in a common law country. And that's because the ICTY is set up as a hybrid civil common law institution. It works under rules of evidence, which is a hybrid of the two systems. So that means the rules of evidence are much more slack. They'll admit things into evidence that no court in Australia would even want to hear. There's no jury at the ICTY, so they don't have issues of prejudicing the jury. So literally the cases, the judges are overwhelmed by a mountain of evidence that they've let into the chamber, and they don't necessarily have the time or resources to deal with. So that's really where the interns step in to deal with this evidence. So in practice, that means spending weeks at a time looking over court transcripts. I didn't go to court, but I read a lot of transcripts, which is word for word transcripts of what actually happened in court, the questions, the answers, everything like that. So you'll read this evidence, and then also in court, the prosecution or the defence will pull in documentary evidence, which will support their argument. So you analyse this evidence alongside the court transcripts, and from that you write witness summaries. So for every witness, you want to summarise their maybe 2 or 3 days of testimony in a little package of 10 or 20 pages. And then it's that kind of summary of the evidence that the chamber works off. So this has a surprising result that a lot of the evidence is not actually viewed, after it's been introduced into court, it's not actually viewed again by the judges. It's viewed by interns or paid staff, and then it's kind of thrown out. So we act like a filter system to get out all the extraneous evidence that has been let into the chambers. So in that sense, it was a lot like the subject at university, evidence and proof, or some equivalent, where you have a whole of evidence and you're trying to build a case study of it. It's really a lot of evidentiary analysis. So as James mentioned, I study maths, and I found that quite useful. It's kind of like this analytical train of thought that was very similar to what I was doing there. So that interests some people and doesn't interest other people, but you should really keep that in mind if you're considering an internship at the ICTY. The second aspect of my work was drafting minor legal decisions. And I don't mean drafting the judgment, I mean drafting interlocutory applications. So this really shocked me about the work of the court, the sheer number of interlocutory applications the court deals with. Seemingly every week they were publishing a new decision about an aspect of evidence or something to do with some aspect of the case. It was just hundreds of these interlocutory applications, and these all have to be drafted. And so they give these tasks to interns to draft, and then the draft will go to the judges, and the judges will read it and sign off it, because often these interlocutory applications don't affect the case in any substantial sense. They're just necessary for the procedure as defined by the rules of the court. So that assists your legal drafting skills, I guess. So it has benefits for careers in commercial law or anything like that. But it can get a little bit tedious because often the decisions that you're doing are quite similar, and you do a repeated number of these things. But I don't want this to sound like I didn't enjoy my time there, because I really did. It was fantastic work. These cases are very complicated, very complex. If any of you have studied the history of the war in Yugoslavia, you know what I'm talking about. There was a lot of different sides fighting. There was a lot going on, a lot of politics. So you really get into the details of this, because the political side of the war is very crucial to a lot of the outcomes of the cases. So, yeah, if you're interested in this kind of historically complex cases, the ICTY is a great place to be. I mean, whereas in a domestic court, a murder case is a murder case. It doesn't have this kind of overarching thematic element to it. At the ICTY, you know, a war crimes case, which would, in essence, is a murder case, has this other side to it, which you really have to bear in mind when you're looking at the evidence, because it all filters in to the prosecution's case, and on the other side, the defence's case. So it is challenging work, and in that sense, it is rewarding work. And the interns do get a lot of responsibility. As I mentioned before, sometimes the only person that sees a bit of evidence is the intern. And so if you are not thinking fully, if you've had a big night the night before or something like that, and you throw out this bit of evidence, that could be crucial to the defence's case, and that could be the difference between them getting off or them going to jail. That's obviously an exaggeration, but in some sense, that is true, and it is very easy for evidence to get lost when you have that sheer amount of evidence in the chamber. So I should mention, as a caveat to that, it really depends a lot on which chamber you're assigned to. So that was how it operated in my chamber, but just speaking to other interns, they did slightly different things. More or less the same, but some did more legal drafting, less evidence analysis. Some did more evidence analysis, less drafting. If their cases were in court, they would be in court assisting with various aspects of the actual hearing. And so they had a different experience. And of course, all that I've just said applies exclusively to the chambers. As I mentioned before, you can do an internship in chambers, but you can also do an internship in the OTP, which is the Office of the Prosecutor. So the ICTUI, just to explain, divides into two sections, the prosecutor and the chambers. And you can do your internship in one of these two places. There's also a possibility to do your internship with the defence. And now the defence is not actually a part of the ICTUI institution, but you can, there is like a central body that sends interns out to various defence teams. So you can apply to this central body and then go assist on the defence, which is a very, very different experience. If you work for the defence, they're often very under-resourced, understaffed, so you actually are involved fully in the bringing of the defence's case. So I think it would be a fascinating experience to work for the defence, although on the downside, you're not doing an internship with the institution per se, and so you don't get all the benefits of having done an internship at the UN. Okay, so what else do I have to say? Another thing that surprised me about, and this is completely changing tack, another thing that surprised me about the internship at the ICTUI was how much I enjoyed actually being in The Hague. So before I went, someone described The Hague to me as a little bit like Canberra of the Netherlands. It's bureaucratic, it's got a parliament there, not the most interesting place, but it actually turned out to be a very beautiful city and a lot going on and a lot happening. And I mean this in a social sense, but I also mean this in a legal sense. It really is the legal capital, the international law capital of the world. So you have the ICTUI, the ICC, the Special Tribunal for Lebanon, the Special Tribunal for Sierra Leone, the Permanent Court of Arbitration, all in the same city. And it's a very small city. So it means when you go out on the town, you'll meet interns from other institutions just by chance. And so it is nice to kind of chat to these other people and see what's going on in these different tribunals. You really feel a part of this whole international justice system. You also get a chance to sit in on a lot of interesting lecture series. There's always some academic or some previous judge giving a public lecture in town, and so you can definitely go along to those. And in that sense, you can grow your knowledge of international humanitarian law through these different aspects of being in The Hague. You can also go sit in on ICC hearings or even ICJ hearings. So while I was there, the ICJ handed down the decision in Diallo. I don't know if anyone studied international law, but Diallo was a decision that's been going on for 8 years, and the judgment just happened to come out when I was there. So I went along to the hearing, and that was a great experience. And yeah, so it's a good place to be, and it really opens your eyes to different possibilities to go on and perhaps get a career in IHL. So one thing I should probably mention is that to work at the ICTUI, to be one of these paid staffs that actually do deal with the cases and the judges directly, you pretty much have to do an internship as a prerequisite. It's quite rare to go straight in to the ICTUI without having done an internship. So it is a kind of necessary step. So that's one thing to think about. But while you're there, you also hear about a whole lot of other opportunities that you might want to pursue later on in your career. So James mentioned briefly that I was in the French chamber. So I might just talk a little bit about the differences of that as opposed to being in the English language chamber, if anyone's interested in going to work in the French chamber. So French is a very important language at the ICTUI and more generally in international law. And it's even more important. The question people often ask is why is ICTUI, why is French at all involved in the ICTUI? It was a conflict that occurred in Yugoslavia, nothing to do with French at all. But the question is really why isn't it more involved in the ICTUI? Because if you look at institutions like the ICC, it's actually more francophone than the ICTUI. And the reason is because the United States was heavily involved in the ICTUI, but they weren't that involved in setting up the ICC. So the French influence was even more important in the ICC. And it is the language, or it was the language of diplomacy, even if it no longer is. So it is an important language. And there's 2 French chambers and about 6 English chambers, so that gives you some idea of the language balance. And so it is, in my chamber, it was the working language of the court, or everything, all the evidence, all the hearings, all like that was in the French language. But it also was important in how the style of the chamber operated. So my chamber worked in a very civil sense, which meant that the judges were interventionists. They were always interrupting counsel, always asking questions. And I imagine, I don't have that much experience in domestic criminal courts, but I imagine the judges sit back and hear the evidence. It's kind of the paradigm of criminal law in the common law countries, but this was very interventionist. And that's a different experience to being in English chambers. So in terms of applying for a position at the ICTY, I think if anyone has experience in French, it is a good idea to play that up in the application. So in the application it says, do you speak English? Yes, no. Do you speak French? Yes, no. And so if you do have a bit of French, tick yes, because you might get a position in the French chamber, because they're definitely easier to get. There's much less competition, and there's much less people that speak French. And in terms of the level of French you need, my level was probably a little bit above high school, so I did do an exchange to France for a year, but it doesn't have to be fluent, it doesn't have to be native speaker. And in fact, they like non-French people in the chambers, because I think in a sense it legitimizes the existence of the chamber, because they can say, look, there are people that aren't French that speak French, and so it is a language that's legitimate to be in the court. And a lot of the interns, 80% of the English language interns don't have English as their first language, so there's no reason why, if French isn't your first language, you can't do it in the French section. So lastly, I might just say, in terms of applying for the ICTY, one thing that is crucial to keep in mind is that it is in the process of winding up. It won't exist in 2 years' time. It just won't be there. It's operating at full capacity at the moment, but there's no new cases pending. There's 2 indictments pending. There's 2 fugitives who are on the run from the authorities, and so if they catch them, they may start up new cases, but at the moment that looks unlikely. And so over the next year, will be winding up, and probably by the middle of next year, there will be no work in the trial chambers anymore. There will just be appellate work, and in another year after that, there won't even be appellate work. So if you are thinking about going to the ICTY, now is definitely the time to apply, because you do have to apply that 6 months in advance to get a position. So I think that's about the last thing.
Thank you, Stephen. I'd like to introduce our second speaker tonight, Heidi Edwards. She's a graduate from the Arts faculty at the University of Melbourne. She's currently studying her Juris Doctor at the Melbourne Law School. And in 2009, she worked as an intern at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda in Tanzania. And to underline her absolute dedication to IHL, she has also just returned from the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, where she was an intern over summer. So I invite Heidi up here to talk about those experiences. Would you please make her welcome?
Hi everyone, I am indeed Heidi, and I have interned at both the ICTR and the ECCC. Some of my experiences will very closely align with those of Stephen's, and some will be completely different. And I suppose that highlights as like the first thing, that being an intern in any kind of international criminal tribunal or any kind of international context at all can be completely different, both among organisations and within organisations. I think people I speak to that have been to the ICTR just have completely different experiences. So I suppose that's my first point. I did intern at the ICTR for 5 months. I was in the Office of the Prosecutor on the Gatetti trial team, and I'll outline what the ICTR is, because Stephen has done so eloquently for the ICTY. Similar to the ICTY, as in it was established by the Security Council. It's for the people most senior who committed the Rwandan genocide, basically. The ECCC, on the other hand, which I just returned from being an intern there for 3 months in the Supreme Court chambers, is a little bit different. It's a hybridised, internationalised tribunal, so it was made through treaty between the UN and the Cambodian government. So it has jurisdiction over crimes against humanity, but it is not a standalone thing. It is meant to be part of the Cambodian court system. This is something I didn't really fully appreciate as a massive difference before I went, but it is. I thought I would start at the application process and kind of go from there, and give you some practical advice, which I suppose you were probably all here to listen to more than anything else. When I applied for ICTR, I was completely underqualified. I cannot stress how underqualified I was. I had a BA. I was kind of just on my year off. I was really interested in international law. The JD was a flicker in the back of my mind. But and I'd had experience in international relations, but I didn't know if I wanted to be a lawyer. I didn't know anything. So I was kind of stressed about my application being accepted. Well, not stressed, I just thought it was something I should do. So I applied, and it's quite a rigorous process. You need like 2 academic referees, you need to fill out the whole forms. They ask you if you speak French, and I am completely monolingual. I was like everyone else will be bilingual and stuff. So I sent my application 5 months early off in the mail. Didn't hear anything a few months. I was like, oh, that's alright. Didn't hear anything for a few more months. I was like, oh, that's okay. Suddenly it was 2 months before I was meant to be starting this internship, and I was like, oh, I haven't heard. I probably just haven't been accepted. I was calling the internship coordinator, possibly went from once a week to once, a couple times a week to once a day. I was starting to doubt whether she exists. Anyway, so I didn't hear anything back, and this seems to be a very common experience at the ICTR. So if anyone wants to apply for the ICTR, they are very willing to take people. Now, I was a little bit underqualified, but there have been people with PhDs in IHL, and they still haven't heard back. So my advice for the ICTR is bank on going. Tanzania is not the easiest place to get to in the world, and they are very keen for people to work for free for them. Of course, any experience that you do have is a terrific addition, but if you don't hear, don't take that as a reflection of your application, is my advice. And also, I needed to book flights. I was quite poor, and I just went ahead and did that, and that's also something that I could recommend. Now, the ECCC is like a completely different scenario. The application process is so coordinated. It's run by a guy called Scott, who's a lovely guy, who is not paid to do this. And he just does it as the kind of this easy heart, because he realises it's quite a difficult process for interns. He got back to me within a couple of months, and this time, of course, I was a little bit more qualified, having the previous experience and also having some of my law degree. So I don't know. I'm not sure if it's a reflection of that, but they actually hold interviews. They do like you to be at a postgraduate level. So my understanding is they're a little bit more picky than they are at the ICTR, and I'm not sure why that is, but that's just the way what I experienced. I think it would be helpful if I explained a bit of the system about how they actually recruit interns, because this is something that I didn't understand, and you don't understand where your application is or what it's doing. So basically it goes into the HR section, of course, and then it gets sent. You preference a place where you want to be, whether that's OTP or whether it's the chamber or defence. And they send it out to the person, your number 1 pick, and they say, do you want this person? And then if they don't, it goes back. So these people are very overworked and underpaid, important lawyers, and looking at it in the intern application is not always their number 1 priority. So basically, if there's not an intern coordinator who's going to be a little pushy with them and say, give us an outcome of the application, this is how I understand it takes a little bit long. So do understand these kind of things, I think, is an important thing to be aware of. My second piece of advice for applying is to research your preferences for the sections that you want to be in. I think this is really important because people often say, oh, that would be kind of cool to be in like the investigative chamber of the ECCC. It sounds really nice. And it would be cool if they were doing any work at the time that you're there. So I think that it's really important to research what's going on at the institution before you apply and aim your application to that. Yes. Well, second point is don't be too stressed. Once the application processes and you've been accepted, don't be too stressed about visas and moving to another country. I know it's a little bit daunting thinking about moving to Tanzania or Cambodia or anything, and I really, really stressed before I went to Tanzania, but I realised that there's actually very big limits on what you can organise when you're not in country in regards to living arrangements, visas, any kind of issues like that you have. That's my advice. Of course, everybody's different and they need to have things more organised than others. But the second time around with Cambodia, I was so much less stressed and I just rocked up and everything worked out. Although a really good resource you should take advantage of is networking. Just find a friend of a friend who has been there or is there and email them. And people email me all the time at the ICTR, and they email me a little bit at the ECCC, just people that have gone to uni, and I'm really happy, and I'm sure any intern would be happy to give their advice on the application process and things, so some stresses can be avoided, and it's really good for setting up kind of housing and all those practical things. In regards to living in countries like Cambodia and Tanzania, I suppose it's a little different from being in The Hague. It's obviously they're both developing countries. I find them much easier than living in Melbourne, just because the ease of getting around and doing great, fantastic things on the weekends and stuff is really nice. Some people really, really struggle with things being different than being at home. Actually, I tried to find a house with an American girl when I first got to Cambodia, and I was shocked at what she expected from the houses. Of course, things are not going to be the same as they are at home. And I suppose that could be a difficulty to some people. I think most people are interested in international careers. It's not going to be such a problem, though. The cases I worked on. Now, I was on the Gatete trial team. Gatete was the leader of basically responsible for the genocide in the whole east side of Rwanda. Now, that's quite a rural area and an unknown area of Rwanda. I was lucky enough to be there when the prosecution case went to trial. So I did case prep, and then I was in court all the time. Sorry. It is the intern dream to be in court, I think. So I saw both those stages of trial, which was really interesting. Now, I was in the Supreme Court chamber of the ECCC, which is the highest appellate court. It's actually 4 different chambers of the ECCC, which makes it very different to just the usual trial appeal stage. So I was dealing at the ECCC with Bourke's appeal, who's the guy who ran S21. He's the most notorious guy. There's only 2 cases actually at the ECCC. Case 1, which is Bourke, and case 2, which is the group of senior leaders. And so case 1 has just got to the appellate stage, and so I was doing prep for the appeal, and I didn't get to be in court, but I did do a lot of, I drafted interlocutory appeals, and I also did a large section of the preparatory document for the judgment, and the hearing is being held at the end of this month, so we'll see how much that stays. But anyway, in the Bourke appeal, there was actually appeals from 3 different types of parties. There was the accused, Bourke himself, the prosecution, who appealed on sentencing, and civil parties. Now, civil parties is something that I was completely mind-boggled by, both before and when I was there. They have a similar system at the ICC at the moment now as well, where you can join, victims can join to parties as a party to the proceedings, and they have certain rights that they can invoke during the trial, and they can give evidence, and reparations are also a big issue in these kind of cases. And all 3 groups of civil parties appealed on both their status, and which is admissibility issue, and also the reparations that they received, which was basically nothing. So they all so it's not just a case of working with an appeal that is an appeal from 1 party or even 2 parties. We basically had 6 different appeals to deal with, which was something that I had never experienced, and I don't think you'd experience really in a domestic setting, unless you have lots of joint people or something. Something I should mention about everyday kind of work at these tribunals is the bus ride. Like, this is a big part of my day at both of the tribunals. In Cambodia, it was an hour to an hour and a half long, there and back every day. It's in an old military barracks, both for security reasons. That's something to note as well, that the court is in country, as opposed to the court in Tanzania, which is obviously out of country, like you would find at The Hague or something. It's obviously proximate, but nothing like Cambodia. So they needed to lock it down if that was necessary. And also, it's Phnom Penh. It's like a bulging Asian city, and they just couldn't fit it in anywhere else. So every day, you kind of walk down the road and get picked up by a bus like little school children, and carted off to an hour and a half out of Phnom Penh. I didn't like this at all, because it means that I couldn't work late. There's only 1 late bus. You couldn't work early, and so basically you'd be trying to cram in as much work as you could in the 8 hours that you're allowed to be there. At the ICTR, it was a bus as well. And we actually stood outside our house with all the school children being picked up. So there was like a bunch of three people in suits and a whole bunch of little kids in like these like gorgeous little uniforms. So that was a little bit embarrassing. Now, my experience in everyday work, it was really different at the ICTR and the ECCC. My day at the ICTR started with a coffee and a cigarette. Now, smoking seems to be, I don't know if it's the large French contingent at all of these tribunals, or just the fact that people are quite bored and they're quite cheap. But lots of people smoke. This is not a prerequisite to being an intern by any means. But my boss was a very big smoker, and he loved a coffee, and lucky we saw eye to eye on these things. We would actually have meetings for about an hour every morning over a coffee and cigarette, which was terrific. I had a really big social team at the ICTR. We were really close, and we had mojitos like every Friday night, and if there'd be late fightings, we'd all run down to the pub and stuff like that. So beer, which some people would know, and have mojitos and things like that. Now, in contrast of that, the social side of the ECCC, professionally, like at work, was really hard. I was actually the first international intern in the Supreme Court chamber. This is just by timing, not to anything special, but basically nobody knew what to do with me. So I was put in an office with 6 national staff. Now, that's also a distinction I should note, is that there's national staff and UN staff in Cambodia. So not everyone is a UN staff member. And there's national interns as well, and they're administrative interns, so they don't have any legal experience, and they kind of thought I was them. I was an admin intern, which is fine, and everyone does like grunt work at these things. That's something else I should mention, photocopying alert. But every time I ask for something, I get the same response, which is not for interns. And this could be the most basic thing, like a new chair or something. In fact, it was a bit of a joke around the court that we were going to get Heidi a t-shirt that said not for interns. And my boss was in a separate part of the court because we hadn't even got an office set up. And so he was always having to call them to tell them not to be mean to me. And it was really quite a struggle to work cross-culturally in that respect. And their English was, because it works in Khmer, everything's translated. English is not at all a prerequisite for the national staff to work there. So we had a few communication issues, and also Cambodian society is in general very hierarchical and a little bit patriarchal. Just putting that one out there. And I struggled in an office with mostly men. And especially when I started getting into the work and that judges would come in and talk to me, they really tried to, in a way, and we actually ended up being really good friends, and this is a really good thing for pursuing with working cross-culturally, but they would really try and sabotage that in the nicest way possible that I can use. But, I mean, that was just really a product of me being the first one of a kind, and not really my role not being set out for me. I suppose that was probably the worst experience that I had at the tribunal, is that initial stage at the ECCC, especially as I wasn't expecting it, because I had been at the ICTR, I had worked in Africa, which if anyone has worked in East Africa, I mean, African time is something that you take a long time to get used to, and I could handle that fine. And so I was like, oh, cross-cultural stuff is easy, this is going to be easy, and then I really did struggle, and it was something that really challenged me personally, but really good. It was really a good experience in the end as well. One of the best experiences I had at the ICTR was the free flight to Rwanda. Now, you can get on the plane with the witnesses and get a free flight to Rwanda. This sounds like a great idea. So you fill out the forms and you go and kind of suck up to the travel guys, and they say, okay, you can get on a flight and blah, 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 blah. So me and my friend got on one of these flights and got to Rwanda. Now, little did we know that the Ziggy appeals judgment, which actually from the Hague actually acquitted Ziggy, had just come down. And so we were not very welcome in Rwanda by the time we got there, which we did. We kind of heard on the radio, a friend called us and was like, oh, there's people protesting outside the ICTR compound in Kigali, just keep on the low and stuff. So we were meant to go for a 4-day trip to Kigali. We ended up in Rwanda for 10 days because they weren't flying. So that was an interesting experience, both underwear-wise and otherwise. But going to Rwanda was actually one of the most terrific parts of that experience. As I mentioned, being in country I think is really important, and seeing where these things happened. I actually had a great experience in Rwanda, and I mean, being stuck there was a little scary at first, but it ended up being really terrific. We just travelled around. Like, Rwanda is a beautiful country, and it's very easy compared to Tanzania to travel around in. And we just travelled around. We actually went up to we actually went up north, and we're just having a walk around Lake Kivu, and there was a guy like hitting golf balls. So I went, that's a little bit weird. And he's like, I saw some white girls, like Mzungu girls, and he's like, hello, hello, and we're like, this is a little bit strange, and he started talking to us. He actually ended up to be the general of the Rwandese army, which I don't know if you know any politics about like the East African kind of thing, where he's just next to Congo. This is a little scary. Anyway, and so he actually invited us for dinner, and we were like, should we not? Anyway, we went, and anyway, he was actually a nice guy, apart from, you know, anything that I don't know that he's doing. But we thought it'd be fun to go to Congo the next day, and he actually said, I don't think you should do that because everyone around town has seen you with me. So it was an interesting experience to be so, because I was so separate to the politics in Tanzania, not being in country, to actually kind of have that in your face a little bit was a really good experience, I think. Now my best experience I think at the ICCC is working with judges. My experience is very different to what you described at the ICTY, and I think this is a product of it literally being on the international side. Myself and my boss, for a month and a half, then more interns came responding to any need of the 3 international judges. So I actually got to have a lot of input into judicial decision making, what they thought. They were really happy to invite me into their offices and actually like have a chat with me. I mean, this was really daunting for me. I had really never worked with judges before, so you know, there's the whole thing of what you should call them and all of that. But you know, I really appreciated the fact that they were giving me the time of day to kind of change their mind on like serious legal issues. And that was just kind of gobsmacked me in a little bit. And so I drafted quite a few interlocutory appeals, and as I said, I drafted some of the preparatory documents, and it was really interesting. You know, you're always one step ahead research-wise than the judges because they have pretty time poor, but they're always one step ahead of you with reasoning. So it's really good being challenged in a legal way like that, I think, and it was a real privilege. My most challenging experiences probably were, I think I've been through them at the ICCC, which is the cross-cultural thing. At the ICTR, there was a moment when I kind of was just a little bit smacked in the face with what I was doing. I did prep for trial, which is actually really amazing that I got to prep witnesses. So I would go through their testimony, figure out what was the most exculpatory things that they had to say, and we would prep them about, you know, what it's like being in court. These are people from very rural places, and they have no idea about how the court system works. And so we would go through them, what they should expect, what questions we're going to ask them, and things like that, and how they're going to be crossed. And this one guy was telling me his story, and he had a really quite horrific story where his wife had been killed, and he tried to protect her, and all these things, and he was just crying, like he was bawling his eyes out. He was actually a Muslim, and just culturally they're much more open with their emotions, I found, than like Christian or atheist Rwandan people. They would often be much more emotional, understand. So he was telling his story, and I was sitting there with the attorney that I worked with, I'm very close with, and I understand a bit of French. And so we go from Kinyarwanda to French and then to English, which is always frustrating. It's a very slow process. And I was sitting there, and I was getting very annoyed at him because I just wanted him to tell me what he knew. And I was saying, stop crying, like this is so annoying, but we don't have any time, we've got to prep the trial. And then it just smacked me in the face, like how cold and forensic that I had become about terrible atrocities that had happened. And that was very challenging for me on a personal level. And the fact that I could read witness statements about terrible things, and including rape, that I would not feel anything about. And I mean, I think at the end of the day, this is an important part of being able to do these kind of jobs. But at the same time, for me to be that impatient with someone who's a human is also like a terrible part of the job. And I think that it's quite common you see lawyers, especially people who've been there for quite a long time. So my advice is try not to lose your humanity. The best thing about these positions professionally is that you get to make great contacts. That's the number, and also you don't get a job without doing a couple of internships or a internship in these kind of areas. I mean, there is the odd anomaly, but mostly people have had a strong background or that they know someone through it. I was really lucky. I worked as the Chief of Prosecution in Tanzania, and I was also lucky that I had such a good relationship with my judges. There's also a judge, who's in one of the photos, Justice Rowan Downing, who is a QC here, and he's like been really amazing person to know. There he is next to me in the photo. And so, I mean, they will help you do anything once they know who you are, and once they have a respect for like your work ethic and the fact that you've given up a lot of your time to come and help them. I think this is a really invaluable thing to achieve. And it's not just about networking and schmoozing and stuff, but it's also about developing really good relationships with mentors that you can respect over a long period of time. The people that work in these tribunals could be getting paid a lot more in the private sector, and they do it because it's a passion mostly. I mean, this is just a generalisation, and I think, and there are also some really good lawyers, and don't get me wrong, there's also some really bad ones, but I think if you weed them out and you find the good ones, I think they can be a real source of inspiration and also just really good for your career. So that's a really good aspect. I think these kind of experiences well build your insight into international criminal law more than anything else could. So, I mean, now someone can kind of mention a case to me or a certain legal issue, and I can you know, have a starting point of case law which just comes to my mind. And I think that's pretty amazing. At the same time, this is like an IHL context. I would totally agree that at the ad hoc tribunals, you really don't interact with greater areas of international law. So some of the jurisprudence you'll be looking at are procedural stuff, like I did a bulk of discovery and a bulk of drafting of that discovery, and you know, who can read what at what time at the ICTR, which is really not that exciting. And I mean, the rules of procedure and evidence, you know, will become your best friend. So it's like not different to any other law in that respect. Saying that, at the ECCC, I did get to deal with some really good conceptual issues because of the nature of it being treaty-based. So, you know, I could apply the Geneva Conventions or like the Vienna Convention like willy-nilly in some ways. And I think that really gave me a really good working knowledge of how practically different institutions and different sources of law can interact. And so there was some really tricky issues that I dealt with there, and I think that was really, really good. I think my closing statements would be that the best thing about doing these internships is actually how critical you become. I think we have a tendency to study IHL or ICL and become over-romanticize it a little bit. At the end of the day, it's just like any institution. It's really bureaucratic. There are some really big downfalls, and there's also a lot of politics that surrounds it. A lot of my friends when I was in Cambodia actually worked for NGOs, and it was really shocking to me to see the kind of disdain they had for the UN, and especially what we were doing at the court, because they saw that it was really backwards. It was looking into the past, it wasn't helping the people of Cambodia, and these are all very, very apt criticisms. And I found myself defending the court, which actually made my opinions about the role of international justice much better formed. And at the ICTR, there's similar criticisms, and I think that without being there, you really can't have those insights. And so I think that's, if nothing else, just becoming a better lawyer and more critical about your views about things is a reason to do these things.
Thank you, Heidi. I'd like to invite our final speaker up to the lectern. Monique Cormier is a graduate from the University of Adelaide in Arts and Law. She spent a couple of years at Federal Court of Australia as a research assistant. She's done a number of international internships She's currently working at the Melbourne Law School as a research fellow on a war crimes project with the ABCML, and she's also a tutor at La Trobe University. She spent time at Columbia University in 2008 and 2009, and she's going to talk to us about that now.
Okay, thank you very much, James. Yeah, I've been asked to basically talk and give you a brief overview of what you can expect studying a Master of Laws, or LLM, with a focus on international law at a US university. Although my experiences are limited to Columbia, I also applied to and got into Michigan and NYU, and I've got friends who completed their LLMs at NYU, Harvard and Yale, so I can speak with some level of generality about undertaking an LLM program in the US. So why do an LLM? Anyone who's interested in international law jobs, or who's even looked at them, even if you're sort of early on in your career, will see that 9 times out of 10 they require an LLM as sort of the minimum education level. You have to remember you're competing in a global market against people with 5 languages, 5 degrees, 5 internships, years of experience, and if you're sort of really serious about a career in this area, you really need to basically look into an LLM or PhD if academia is something you're interested in. The field is particularly competitive, so the idea that getting an LLM from a top law school might give you an added advantage as well. And I know for a fact that without mine, I wouldn't be in the job that I am today. So why I did an LLM as well, apart from those things, during the final year of my undergraduate LLB, I wrote an honours thesis on a topic of international criminal law, and I really enjoyed it. I found the area particularly fascinating, and I really wanted to pursue this in graduate studies. So for me, the next logical step was to do an LLM. Why study overseas, not in Australia? Well, for me, it was just the incredible range of international law subjects that was on offer by these universities in the US, taught by leading academics, high-profile practitioners. I could tailor my degree to really have a high focus on IHL and international criminal law. So, for example, some of the subjects that I did included international comparative criminal law, law of genocide, transitional justice, IHL, use of force in international law, and I also did something called the United Nations Externship program, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And I enjoyed all of these subjects. I mean, the professors were genuinely interested in their students, really enthusiastic teachers. One of mine even invited the international LLMs to his house to have Thanksgiving with his family, so it was just an amazing experience overall. Another great thing about an overseas LLM is the really diverse international mix of students. The Columbia LLM program is mid-sized. There's about 180, 200 LLM students. Larger ones like NYU and Harvard have about 300 or 400. Smaller ones like Michigan and Yale are only about 30. But the students come from all over the world. They're highly accomplished, really enthusiastic. They want to be there. They're dedicated to spending a year of their lives just graduate study. I mean, the Australian LLM, Australian universities tend to run their LLM courses, geared towards working lawyers. So they're sort of intensive. They're for students who study part-time. LLM programs in the US are designed full-time for a full year. No one works, not even the American JD students. And many classes are sort of mixed JD, LLMs, but the caliber of the US JD students is incredible. There's never any question about, never any question of not undertaking thorough preparation for your class. I mean, the enthusiasm, the intelligence, I mean, it's really, really impressive. I mean, especially from someone coming from an Australian university background where, you're lucky if, half the students will even crack open the readings before a tutorial. So I was just really impressed with that as well. I was just one of 5 Australians at Columbia. There's a large contingent of Europeans, South Americans, South Asians, and many others from all over the world. The average age of an LLM student is 28, and I know this is the case for most of the other law schools as well. So, most have a few years of postgraduate experience, which really does enhance the learning experience. So I was in classes with, Mongolian diplomats, Japanese judges, French academics. Even in my IHL class, there was a group of Israeli students who'd done their IDF service and had some particularly interesting insights to offer on the laws of war. Beyond the classroom, there's a notable focus on international law at Columbia. Obviously, it's got something to do with the fact that New York is a very vibrant international city, home of the UN, and there's a full calendar of international law-related events on all over the city at any time. So while I was a student there, I took advantage of a number of extracurricular activities, such as I did some research assistance for Columbia Human Rights Institute. I attended numerous, conferences, conventions, speeches, seminars. I was a board member of the Columbia Society of International Law. We organised things like a formal dinner to honour James Crawford. I went to seminars taught by Antonio Casese and Gerard Verle. There were lunchtime lectures from every conceivable judge, prosecutor, defence attorney from all the different international criminal tribunals. NGOs like Human Rights Watch and the ICRC and UN officials, politicians, just everyone. It's just absolutely amazing experience. This is sort of a weekly, if not daily, occurrence at the Columbia Law School. But if I was to pick perhaps two highlights of my year at Columbia, I'd have to say my first semester subject called War and Crime, and my second semester UN externship. So War and Crime was actually called a colloquium. What that really was 20 students would meet at a local fine dining restaurant every Friday for an all expenses paid 3-course lunch with wine, and we would listen to a different speaker talk about war and crime, and that was my class. So, and for the UN externship, it's basically a part-time internship. I'm not really sure what the term externship is, why it's called that, but I was lucky enough to be placed at the International Criminal Court United Nations Liaison Office. It's a tiny 2-person office at the UN. I spent every Friday there. I got an all-access UN pass, sat in on closed Security Council sessions where they discussed the arrest warrant of the Sudanese president. I met the ICC prosecutor, Luis Moreno Ocampo. I saw Ban Ki-moon and Nicolas Cage, which is a bit weird, giving a talk on children and war. And so it was just incredible insights into the relationship between the UN and the ICC, and to be able to do this as part of my degree was just sort of phenomenal. Now, how to apply? A few little websites there which might be interesting. How to apply, basically getting into these universities is very competitive. The application process is long, it's involved. When you're looking at personal statements, CV, online application form, certified copies of transcripts and degrees, recommendation letters, plus application fees, and sort of if you want to apply for scholarships and fee waivers, that's sort of all part of it as well. Obviously, the best thing to do is to check the website of the program that you're interested in, the law schools. The LLM guide is actually a really good non-affiliated, useful resource as well for anyone interested in an overseas LLM. What did I do to get in? As James mentioned before, I did my undergraduate degrees at Adelaide Uni, where I focused all my electives on international law, wrote an honours thesis on international criminal law. My grades were good. They were good enough to get me into the honours program, but they were not spectacular. I did luckily get a very high grade for my honours thesis, which gave me a first-class honours result and bolstered my ranking and my grade average. So if your university offers you that option, I would strongly recommend it. After uni, I got admitted to practice law. Again, something I would seriously recommend. Every Australian LLM at Columbia, and even those that I knew at NYU and the other universities, they were all admitted to practice. Even if you've got no intention, I've got no intention of ever practicing law, but it's good to have that sort of on your CV. And so, similarly, there was also a high proportion of students who'd undertaken an associateship or a research assistantship in a court. In the US, this is known as a judicial clerkship. Highly favoured by the admissions people as well. I'd also worked as a research assistant for 2 of my Adelaide Law School professors, and we co-authored an article. So publications are something as well that look good on your CV. And getting some work as a research assistant for a law school professor is something to consider, especially as one of your recommendation letters has to come from an academic. So fostering these relationships now while you're still at uni is a really good idea. And aside from that, I'd done 3 international internships and been involved in some sort of legal volunteer work throughout uni and after. Basically, the more you can do to make yourself competitive, the better. And remember, unless you're absolutely brilliant academically, and I'm talking number 1, number 2 ranked in your whole law school, then it's unlikely that you're going to get in on the strength of your academic record alone. Sort of the final section I thought I might talk to you about is how to pay, because this is quite a important thing. Okay, so it's definitely a major hurdle for most people who do manage to get into these LLM programs. Law school in the US is ridiculously expensive. Just have to be thankful that LLM is 1 year, you don't have to pay for 3 years and end up with a $300,000 debt like a lot of JDs in the US do. And the cost is prohibitive for many. There are a number of excellent, extremely competitive scholarships. These are some of the most prestigious and unfortunately the most sort of difficult to get. There are a number of other options and scholarships available, perhaps, you know, as your own university or other less well-known foundations. You just really have to have a search and apply for as many as you can. I wasn't successful in getting a scholarship. I have several friends who did get Fulbright and Sir Monash. They're the number 1, 2 ranked types of people. So, but instead, you know, there is an option. Perhaps at Columbia there was an option to apply for a full or partial fee waiver on the basis of financial need. I was successful in getting a partial fee waiver, and then the rest I was lucky enough to be able to borrow from my family. So, I mean, the reality is that the majority of LLM students will go into debt, some debt for their degree. My advice would be not to let the cost put you off, because don't be discouraged if you're unsuccessful with scholarships. There are other options. And so basically to conclude, I had a brilliant year at Columbia, definitely one of the most positive experiences of my life. If you're serious about a career in IHL or ICL or international law at all, I would definitely recommend an LLM. And for an experience that offers you something more than just a qualification, I would encourage you to aim high and seriously consider a school like Columbia. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Monique. That concludes the presentations. I'd like to invite any questions from the audience now for any or all of the participating speakers tonight. So we have a microphone here if we need it, but I imagine that we'll be able to hear everybody's questions and responses. Does anybody have any questions? Speakers, yes.
Just for the two interns, how did you guys fund it? Was it completely self-funded, or did you get scholarships?
I self-funded it. There's no actual kind of scholarship program that's set up by the United Nations to fund these things, although students from slightly developing countries, I suppose, there are scholarship options available to them that they wouldn't apply necessarily to Australian students. But I suppose you're not paying tuition fees, so you know if you're not going to rack up $100,000 there doing an internship. I suppose Cambodia and Rwanda is probably a little bit cheaper than the Hague to live in, but the Hague is not prohibitively expensive. It's no more expensive than living expenses in Melbourne, I suppose.
On my side of things, I self-funded entirely my Tanzanian trip. And this is a good question because this was something that really concerned me. And then with Cambodia, I actually chose to go to Cambodia partially. I really wanted to actually go back to the ICTR, but because it was really cheap to live in. And I also got a couple of scholarships of kind of smallish amounts from the Melbourne Law School, which really helped me out there.
Yeah. Appreciate James. I can, with my internships as well that I did previously, somewhere like the Foundation for Young Australians is quite good, and also even your local Rotary Club. I got some money out of mine for one of my internships.
Can I ask what those internships were?
Mine?
Yeah.
I did one at a place called Global Policy Forum in New York in 2005. That was during my degree, and then afterwards I went to the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague, and I didn't love The Hague. And also to the South Asia Human Rights Documentation Centre in New Delhi.
Yes.
Can I ask about your experience working at the United Nations with regards to who else you met there? So obviously, if you're at a university like Columbia, it might be a little bit easier to get an internship, but was there kind of a broad range of interns, or were they all JD or LLM students coming from, you know, high-level universities in New York?
Actually, probably my experience when I was doing my internship at Global Policy Forum was more relevant to that because it was very much a UN based, and I met a